I was standing in the venue's back office when the printer spat out a seating chart I didn't recognize. Same paper stock, same layout I always used. Same table numbers aligned exactly the way I preferred, but the names were wrong. Not unfamiliar in the vague sense. Wrong in a very specific way. 12 names clustered across 3 tables near the front, all written in the same looping cursive, squeezed neatly into the margins like they had always belonged there. Next to them, in blue ink, someone had written, "Family, Friends." I remember the quiet more than anything, that strange, padded silence that only exists in venues before guests arrive. Chairs lined up perfectly, glassware already polished, florals still cold from storage. Everything ready for a wedding that hadn't started yet, except the guest list had somehow become a different story altogether. I checked the timestamp on the file, updated at 6:42 a.m. I hadn't touched it. As a wedding planner, you learn to trust systems. Files don't change themselves. Seating charts don't rewrite their own social hierarchies overnight. Someone always authorizes a change, even when they insist later that they didn't. I scrolled down slowly, my finger hovering as if the screen might flinch. That's when I saw the adjustments ripple outward. Table capacities recalculated. The venue's maximum nudged closer to its limit. A few familiar names pushed further back. Still there, technically, just displaced. In my inbox, a new message sat unopened. We adjusted for the added headcount. No question mark. No explanation. Just confirmation, written in the neutral tone venues use when they assume a decision has already survived whatever internal politics it needed to survive. I could already picture how this would be explained to me, as a small tweak. A harmless addition, the kind of thing people do when they believe logistics are interchangeable and relationships are not. The kind of thing that only feels minor if you're not the one who has to absorb the consequences. What struck me wasn't just the number 12 people is noticeable, but it's not chaos. What struck me was the placement. Front tables, prime line seats that had been negotiated over carefully, emotionally, sometimes tearfully. And what struck me most was what wasn't immediately visible. Who had given access, how early this decision had been made. Why these people, specifically, and which names had quietly slid off the list to make room. I thought about the bride, still hours away, probably believing everything was exactly where she'd left it. I thought about the groom, assuming all maternal involvement had already peaked. And I thought about how weddings don't collapse from explosions. They collapse from adjustments that everyone pretends are reasonable. I closed the file without saving anything. There was still time before anyone else noticed, but not much. I met Laura Mitchell later that morning in the bridal suite, the kind of room designed to make people feel calm by pretending nothing outside of it exists. She was sitting cross-legged on the sofa, dress bag still zipped. Phone face down beside her, like a promise she didn't want to open yet. Her makeup artist was running late. Her mother had stepped out to take a call. It was one of those rare pauses where the wedding hadn't fully claimed her attention, and she looked almost like herself again. She smiled when she saw me. Not the polite smile brides give vendors, but the relieved one. The one that says, "You're the person who knows how this is supposed to work." "Everything okay?" she asked. That question always comes loaded, whether people realize it or not. It's never about flowers or timelines. It's about whether the invisible agreements are still holding. I told her yes, not because everything was okay, but because nothing had technically exploded yet. In my job, timing matters. You don't drop information like a plate. You place it down and watch how the table reacts. She started talking immediately, filling the space about how strange it felt that the day was finally here. About how she'd slept poorly, about how Charlotte Mitchell had been so involved, said with a small laugh that didn't quite land. "She means well," Laura added quickly, as if correcting herself out loud. "She just likes to help." I've learned to listen for the corrections more than the statements. As she spoke, she kept glancing at her phone, checking notifications that weren't coming yet. There's always a moment before a wedding where the bride believes the hardest parts are over, that the decisions have been made, that nothing new can enter the system without permission. I asked her, casually, when she'd last looked at the seating chart. She shrugged. Last week, I think, unless you needed changes. I shook my head. I didn't tell her about the printed version waiting downstairs. I didn't tell her about the handwriting. I didn't tell her that someone else had already decided we're 12, unfamiliar. Lives would sit in the front row of her marriage. Instead, I asked her how she was feeling about family dynamics, about expectations, about how much space she wanted people to have today. She exhaled, long and slow. I just want it to be simple, she said. I don't want to manage anyone else's emotions, especially not today. That was when I knew how fragile the situation really was. Because nothing disrupts simplicity faster than someone who believes they're entitled to redefine it. She leaned back against the cushions and closed her eyes for a second. She's been talking a lot about who should be there, she said, carefully. People who watched Ben grow up, people who supported the family. I told her we had limits. Budget, space, all of that. She said she understood. Understood is a dangerous word in weddings. It often means postponed. I watched her face as she spoke, how she still believed the boundary had held, how she still thought the guest list was a finished document instead of a living negotiation. Downstairs, tables were already set, names already placed, decisions already made in ink. And Laura was still talking about simplicity, unaware that the hardest emotional math of the day had already been done without her. Laura Mitchell had always been precise, not rigid, not controlling, just exact, in the quiet way that comes from having learned early that clarity prevents disappointment. I saw it in how she folded her hands when she spoke, in how she paused before answering questions, as if checking her own internal list before offering anything out loud. This wedding hadn't been thrown together on enthusiasm alone. It had been constructed carefully, decision by decision, compromise by compromise, until it felt stable enough to hold other people's expectations. That morning, she was still holding on to that stability. As the room slowly filled back up, makeup artists arriving, bridesmaids drifting in with coffees and garment bags, Laura shifted into hosting mode. She smiled more. She asked how everyone was doing. She thanked people for being there. The emotional labor had already begun, even before the ceremony. Ben Mitchell hadn't stopped by yet. That wasn't unusual. Grooms tend to orbit differently on the wedding day, pulled into parallel schedules that rarely intersect until the aisle forces it. Still, I noticed how often Laura's eyes flicked toward the door, just long enough to register absence, not long enough to accuse it. Charlotte Mitchell, on the other hand, had been very present. Not physically in the room at that moment, but present in conversation, in tone, in the way Laura softened certain phrases instinctively, as if Charlotte might overhear them through the walls. "She's just excited," Laura said at one point, adjusting the strap of her robe. "This is a big day for her too." That sentence did a lot of work. I asked Laura how long she and Ben had been engaged. 14 months, she said. "We wanted time to do it right. And honestly, time helped. At first, there were a lot of opinions." She smiled again, but this one had edges. Opinions usually arrive early and fade once decisions are locked. Or they evolve into something else entirely. I'd seen both outcomes enough times to recognize the fork long before couples did. Laura told me about the guest list process, how she and Ben had started with numbers, how they'd argued gently about priorities. How they'd cut coworkers to make room for cousins, then cut cousins to make room for friends who felt like family. It had been emotional, but mutual. By the time we finalized it, she said, it felt fair, balanced. Balanced is another dangerous word. It assumes no one will put their thumb on the scale later. She mentioned Charlotte again, this time with more detail. How she'd offered to help with outreach. How she'd volunteered to answer questions from extended family so Laura wouldn't have to. How grateful Laura had been for that buffer at first. I didn't want to be the bad guy, she admitted quietly. I didn't want people to feel unwelcome. I thought about the blue ink on the seating chart, about how welcoming can sometimes look exactly like overstepping, depending on who's holding the pen. Laura's phone buzzed then. A message preview flashed across the screen before she could turn it over. From Charlotte, Laura didn't open it. She didn't have to. The moment lingered anyway, suspended between curiosity and restraint. She tucked the phone under a pillow instead, as if placing it out of sight could delay whatever decision was waiting inside it. Outside the suite, staff were finalizing place settings, ushers were being briefed. The ceremony timeline was holding steady. Inside, Laura was still narrating her wedding as something contained, controlled, finished. She didn't know yet that the shape of the room had already changed. Charlotte Mitchell arrived the way women like her often do, not early enough to seem anxious, not late enough to appear careless. She moved through the venue as if it were a familiar extension of her own living room, greeting staff with polite confidence, touching backs lightly, asking questions she already knew the answers to. I watched her from a distance first. That's habit. You learn more that way. She was dressed impeccably, neutral colors, nothing that would compete with the bride, everything that would signal importance without asking permission. Her posture carried a lifetime of being listened to. When she spoke, people leaned in without realizing they were doing it. When she saw me, her face lit up with recognition. "Emily," she said warmly, "I'm so glad you're here. I don't know what we'd do without you today." That sentence always sounds like gratitude. Sometimes it's also a claim. She asked about the timeline, about the ceremony flow, about whether the florist had confirmed the extra arrangements she'd mentioned earlier in the week. She phrased everything as a check-in, never a request. It created the impression that she was simply making sure things were aligned, not steering them. Laura joined us a few minutes later, and I felt the temperature of the conversation shift instantly. Laura's shoulders softened, her voice lifted. She stepped slightly to the side, instinctively making room. Charlotte kissed her cheek, careful not to disturb makeup. "You look beautiful," she said. "I knew you would." Then, almost seamlessly, she added, "I've been answering so many messages this morning. Everyone is just thrilled." Everyone is another word that carries weight. Laura smiled, the way people do when they don't want to ask a follow-up question they're not sure they want answered. "I'm glad," she said. "I was worried people might be confused." "Oh, they were at first," Charlotte replied lightly. "But I clarified things." Clarified is a flexible verb. It can mean explanation. It can also mean interpretation. Charlotte turned to me then, lowering her voice just enough to suggest discretion. "I hope it was okay that I helped streamline some of the communication," she said. I didn't want Laura to be overwhelmed. She has enough to think about. She was smiling, but she was watching me closely, measuring my response. People like Charlotte don't bulldoze, they advance carefully, testing where resistance lives. I said something neutral. I always do. Something about how support can be helpful when everyone's on the same page. Laura nodded eagerly. "It really helped," she said. "I didn't want to deal with guest questions this week." Charlotte reached out and squeezed her hand. "Of course, sweetheart. That's what I'm here for." I noticed then how naturally Laura deferred, how relief can blur into permission when you're tired enough. Charlotte had positioned herself as a buffer, a translator, a shield between Laura and potential conflict. It's an easy role to accept. It feels generous, protective. It also creates access. Charlotte excused herself to check on something near the reception hall. As she walked away, I caught a glimpse of her phone screen lighting up with notifications, names, replies, threads that had clearly been active for some time. Laura watched her go, her expression soft, almost grateful. "She just wants everyone to feel included," Laura said to me quietly. "I know she can be. A lot. But her heart's in the right place." I thought again about the seating chart, about the handwriting, about how inclusion always comes at a cost, even when it's framed as kindness. Charlotte had found a way to be helpful without appearing intrusive, and that made her the most dangerous kind of involved. The first place Charlotte crossed into wasn't dramatic. That's what made it so effective. It happened in a hallway conversation, the kind that doesn't register as important until later. When you realize it was the moment something irreversible shifted. She stopped me near the catering office, her voice lowered, her tone almost apologetic. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I asked the venue for the most recent guest count, just to make sure we weren't missing anyone." She framed it like diligence, like responsibility. I told her the numbers were locked. She nodded, smiling, as if we were in agreement. "Of course," she said. "I just wanted to Sometimes people assume they're invited, and it's so awkward to correct them." Assume is another soft word with sharp edges. She didn't mention names. She didn't mention changes. She didn't say anything that would force me to object directly. Instead, she talked about feelings, about embarrassment, about how small misunderstandings can spiral if they're not handled early. "I'd hate for Ben to be uncomfortable," she added. "Especially with people he grew up around." That was the first time she explicitly connected the guest list to Ben, not Laura. It reframed the issue instantly. What had been a shared decision became, subtly, a maternal responsibility. Later, I saw the effects: an updated count sent to catering. A slight adjustment to rentals, nothing alarming in isolation. The kind of tweaks that happen all the time. If you weren't watching closely, you'd miss the pattern entirely. When I asked the venue coordinator about the update, she hesitated for half a second. "Just enough." "Oh," she said, "Ben's mother confirmed it this morning." Confirmed implies authority. I didn't correct her, not yet. I wanted to understand how far the assumption had traveled before I interrupted it. Charlotte hadn't gone after the whole guest list. She'd started with a single territory, people no one could easily argue against. Longtime family friends, church acquaintances, couples who had always been there, people whose absence would look like a statement. Those are the safest additions. They come preloaded with guilt. By the time Laura noticed anything was different, the changes would already feel established. Socially defended, too late to reverse without explanation. I watched Charlotte later in the reception hall, pointing lightly at a table layout, speaking in low tones to a staff member. No urgency, no secrecy, just confidence. She wasn't hiding what she was doing, she was normalizing it. And that's when I knew this wasn't about the guest list itself. This was about territory. About proving that certain spaces could be entered without asking, as long as the entry looked reasonable enough. The problem was, once the first territory is taken, the next ones come easier. By early afternoon, the pattern had settled in. Not loudly, not aggressively. It moved the way habits do, repeating just enough to feel familiar before anyone thought to challenge it. Charlotte didn't announce new decisions. She referenced them as if they'd already been discussed, already agreed upon, already absorbed into the rhythm of the day. I heard it first from the florist. She wanted to make sure there were enough centerpieces near the front, the florist said, adjusting a ribbon. For the additional guests plural, no question attached. Then from catering, again, when a server asked where to place a set of dietary cards that hadn't been on the original plan. Then, from the usher coordinator, who casually mentioned needing clarification on seating priority because some of the family friends were very important to Ben's mom. Each time, the explanation was the same. Charlotte had confirmed it. Charlotte had handled it. Charlotte had said it was fine. And each time, the changes landed just far enough from Laura's immediate view to avoid triggering alarm. Nothing touched the ceremony itself. Nothing altered the vows, the aisle, the timing. The disruption stayed safely in the social layer, where discomfort is easier to dismiss as sensitivity. I found Laura again between hair touch-ups and dress steaming, and she looked lighter than she had earlier. Relieved, even. Charlotte had taken over answering her phone, filtering messages, promising updates only if something was important. It gave Laura space. It also gave Charlotte silence. "Mom's been amazing today," Laura said, sipping water. I don't know how she's keeping up with everyone. I didn't respond right away. I was watching Laura's reflection in the mirror, the way her face softened when she said it. Gratitude is a powerful anesthetic. It dulls the instinct to protect boundaries. Charlotte passed by the open doorway, then phone pressed to her ear, nodding as if the person on the other end could see her. She caught Laura's eye and gave her a reassuring thumbs up. Handled. Laura smiled back. I thought about how repetition works. The first time someone oversteps, it feels like an exception. The second time, it feels like assistance. By the third, it starts to feel like precedent. Charlotte wasn't expanding outward yet. She was reinforcing inward, repeating the same behavior in slightly different forms, teaching everyone around her what was normal now. By the time the ceremony music began its final rehearsal and guests started arriving in small clusters, the seating chart downstairs no longer felt like an anomaly. It felt like the current version of reality. And reality, once established, resists correction. I checked my phone. Another update from the venue. Another quiet confirmation. No one had raised their voice. No one had argued. No one had said no. The pattern had held. For now, the shift didn't announce itself. It never does when control expands successfully. It just stops staying in its lane. What had been contained to seating and numbers began to bleed into tone, into assumptions, into who felt comfortable making decisions without looping anyone else in. I noticed it when a group of women arrived together, all in coordinated pastel dresses, moving as a unit. They didn't check the welcome sign. They didn't look for direction. They walked straight toward the front of the reception space like they already knew where they belonged. One of them laughed and said, loud enough for staff to hear, Charlotte told us we'd be close. She said not to worry, not asked, told. The phrase landed differently than the others had. This wasn't logistics anymore, this was promise. A server approached me moments later, whispering, do we have place cards for the church group? Church group? I asked how many. She hesitated. 6, maybe more. They're together. Together implies permanence. It implies intention. I went to the seating chart again. The handwritten names had multiplied. Not dramatically. Just enough to change the balance of the room. Tables that had once been mixed now leaned heavily in one direction. Social gravity had shifted, and with it, expectations. Charlotte was no longer just adding people. She was curating proximity, deciding who would be seen, who would be heard, who would feel centered in the story of the day. Laura hadn't noticed yet. She was insulated by preparation, by adrenaline, by the belief that the major decisions were behind her. When people stopped by to greet her, they spoke warmly about Charlotte. She's been so wonderful, one guest said. So organized, another added. She really thought of everything. Each compliment reinforced the structure Charlotte had built. Public approval is the strongest form of permission. I caught Charlotte near the bar area, laughing softly with 2 guests I didn't recognize. She introduced them to a coordinator as practically family, her hand resting casually on the back of a chair that hadn't originally been theirs. No one corrected her. Why would they? It all looked reasonable, thoughtful, even. But reasonableness is exactly how boundaries dissolve, not with force, but with politeness, with people choosing not to interrupt because it would feel awkward to do so. The expansion wasn't chaotic. It was efficient, and that efficiency meant something else had to give. I could see it now in the margins, in the names pushed to the edge, in the quiet recalculations happening without acknowledgement. Someone's absence would eventually be noticed. It always is. The only question left was, who would feel it first? The first reaction didn't come from Laura. It came from someone who had nothing to lose. A young woman stood near the escort cards, scanning the display longer than most people did. Not the quick glance of someone looking for their name, but the slow, searching kind. Her smile tightened. She checked again, leaning closer, as if proximity might change the outcome. Then she stepped back. I recognized her immediately. Laura's cousin. One of the first names Laura had insisted on keeping when the list had started to shrink. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask for help. She simply walked away from the table and joined the edge of the room, phone already in her hand. That's how it begins now, not with confrontation, but with quiet verification. A few minutes later, another pause, another glance. A man this time, older, clearly confused, whispering to his wife. They both looked at the chart, then at the room, then back at the chart again. I heard the question before I saw who asked it. Did they move us? The tone wasn't angry. It was embarrassed. I intervened gently, redirecting, offering reassurance. People accept almost anything if it's delivered calmly enough. But reassurance doesn't erase the feeling that something has shifted without your consent. Laura was still tucked away, shielded by activity. But emotions don't stay contained for long at weddings. They travel quickly, hopping from table to table, carried by whispers and glances, and the subtle recalibration of where people place their bodies. Charlotte noticed before Laura did. She always did. She adjusted instantly. Laughter a little louder, touches a little warmer. She intercepted questions before they could reach the bride, explaining things with practiced ease. "Oh, there was a small mix-up," she said to one couple, "but everything's been taken care of." Taken care of is a phrase that sounds final. It discourages. Still, I could feel the undercurrent strengthening. Displacement has a sound. It's the quiet scrape of chairs as people hesitate before sitting. It's the pause before someone commits to a table that doesn't feel like theirs. Laura finally sensed it when a friend approached her with a careful expression. "Hey," she said softly, "just checking. Did something change with the seating?" Laura laughed reflexively. "No, I don't think so." I watched her face as she realized she wasn't sure. That moment, that small fracture between confidence and doubt is where emotion starts to surface, where the story begins to escape its container. Across the room, Charlotte was still smiling. But now, so were fewer other people. Charlotte stepped into the tension, the way someone steps into a room they believe belongs to them. She didn't wait for questions to reach her. She brought the explanation forward, offering it generously, publicly, as if clarity were a gift she'd prepared in advance. "I just want everyone to relax," she said, her voice carrying easily across a small cluster of guests. "There were a few last-minute adjustments, that's all. You know how weddings are." People nodded. Not because they fully understood, but because disagreement would have required effort. And effort, in moments like this, feels impolite. She framed every change as inevitable, as practical, as something that would have happened no matter who was in charge. "We realized there were a few people who would have been hurt not to be included," she continued, smiling sympathetically. "And really, what's a celebration if you leave people out?" That sentence did something important. It inverted responsibility. Anyone who felt displaced now risked appearing selfish. Anyone who questioned the change risked looking unkind. Charlotte hadn't just made decisions, she'd moralized them. Laura heard this part. She was standing only a few feet away, her posture stiffening slightly as the words reached her. I saw the calculation happen in real time. The choice between correcting the narrative or preserving harmony. Charlotte caught her eye and reached out, placing a hand on Laura's arm. "I hope you don't mind," she said, softly enough to sound private, loudly enough to be heard. "I just didn't want you dealing with this today." The room watched. Laura smiled, because smiling was easier than interrupting. Because contradicting Charlotte in front of guests would have required explanation. An explanation would have required admitting that something had gone wrong. Charlotte turned back to the group, her authority now visibly reinforced by Laura's silence. "It's all settled," she said. "Everyone's here to celebrate Ben and Laura. That's what matters." Settled is a powerful word. It suggests closure, even when nothing has actually been resolved. Around them, people adjusted. Some accepted new seats, some exchanged looks, some simply stopped asking. Control doesn't need everyone's agreement, it only needs their fatigue. Laura stayed quiet beside Charlotte, her smile fixed, her eyes searching for me briefly across the room, not accusing, not panicked, just asking, silently, how this had become public before it had ever been private, and whether it was already too late to pull it back. The moment everything tipped wasn't loud. It happened when the doors opened and the room filled all at once, when private discomfort became a shared environment. Conversations overlapped. Chairs scraped. People searched for places that no longer felt intuitive. This is the part most couples imagine as joyful chaos. In reality, it's a social audit. I watched it unfold from the edge of the room, the way I always do when things start to slip beyond correction. Guests instinctively scanned for familiar faces, for anchors, and many of those anchors were no longer where they were supposed to be. The front tables filled quickly, not with Laura's closest friends, not with the people who had helped her move apartments, or stayed up late addressing invitations, or listened patiently to her doubts over the past year. They were filled with Charlotte's people. The church group sat together, already comfortable, laughing easily, greeting one another as if this were a reunion more than a wedding. A pair of older couples leaned back in their chairs, surveying the room with the relaxed posture of people who felt affirmed by their placement. This wasn't accidental seating, this was visibility. Laura entered a few minutes later, guided by applause and soft music. Her attention split between gratitude and sensory overload. She smiled, waved, took it all in the way brides do when they're trying to absorb something they've waited a long time for. Then she saw the front tables. I saw the exact second her smile shifted. Not disappeared, adjusted, as if her brain had encountered a layout that didn't match the blueprint she'd been carrying all day. She looked for people she expected to see. They weren't there. Her eyes moved further back, then to the sides, then back to the front again, as if hoping she'd misread the first impression. Charlotte stood immediately, beaming, drawing attention before confusion could settle. "Isn't it perfect?" she said, her voice cutting through the room with practiced ease. "Everyone's finally together. Everyone." Laura nodded slowly, because standing still felt safer than asking questions. Ben joined them, moments later, oblivious at first, caught in greetings and handshakes. Charlotte kissed his cheek and gestured broadly at the room. "So many people who love you," she said. Ben smiled. He hadn't studied the seating chart. He hadn't needed to. To him, this just looked like celebration. But celebration has layers. I watched Laura as she navigated conversations, as people congratulated her, as a few familiar faces lingered at the edges of the room, polite but distant. I watched her register the imbalance without naming it. Across the space, Charlotte moved confidently, introducing guests, recounting shared histories, weaving herself into the center of the narrative. This wasn't about control anymore. It was about authorship, and the room collectively was beginning to understand whose version of the story it was being asked to participate in. Charlotte didn't notice the shift at first. That was the irony of it. Control had come so easily to her all day that she mistook compliance for comfort. She continued moving through the room, greeting people loudly, touching shoulders, telling stories that placed her at the center of Ben's past, and, by extension, his present. But social rooms have limits, and once those limits are crossed, they don't push back loudly, they withdraw. I saw it in the pauses, in the way conversations stopped briefly when Charlotte approached, then resumed a beat later without inviting her in. In the smiles that stayed polite but didn't linger, in the way Laura's friends clustered together further back, not protesting, just choosing one another. Charlotte began to overcompensate. Her laughter grew sharper, her commentary more performative. She raised her voice slightly when recounting how long she'd known certain guests, how much they'd been through together. Each declaration was meant to reinforce legitimacy. Instead, it highlighted imbalance. People started to notice patterns: who had been placed where, who seemed confused, who looked quietly displaced, and most importantly, who wasn't complaining. Laura wasn't. She moved through the room with restraint, grace stretched thin but intact, She thanked people, she listened, she didn't contradict anyone. And that restraint did more than confrontation ever could. It created contrast. Guests began to recalibrate on their own. They connected dots silently. They noticed how often Charlotte spoke for Laura, how rarely Laura spoke for herself in Charlotte's presence. Ben noticed too, eventually. Not the details, but the temperature. The way Laura's energy shifted when Charlotte entered a conversation. The way his friends didn't sit at the tables they were meant to sit at. He didn't say anything, not yet. Silence, in moments like this, is its own data point. Charlotte, sensing something slipping, but unable to name it, leaned harder into visibility. She pulled people into photos. She positioned herself near Laura whenever cameras appeared. But cameras capture proximity, not legitimacy. By the time dinner was served, the room had quietly reorganized itself. People had chosen where they felt comfortable, not where they'd been told to sit. Charlotte was still at the front, but she was no longer at the center. That's the moment control turns inward. When effort becomes visible, when authority has to announce itself instead of being assumed. Charlotte didn't realize it yet, but socially, the verdict had already been rendered. By the end of the night, nothing had been formally addressed. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where Charlotte was asked to explain herself in front of everyone she had rearranged. Weddings rarely deliver justice that way. They deliver something quieter. I noticed it first when dessert was served. Charlotte stood, ready to guide people again, but no one was waiting for her cue. Guests moved on their own. Small groups formed naturally, drifting toward the people they actually wanted to be near. The room ignored the logic of the seating chart and followed something older, more honest. Laura sat with her friends at the edge of one of the front tables, not reclaiming it, not rejecting it either, just existing there calmly, as if to say she didn't need the space to validate her place. People gravitated toward her, not loudly, not performatively, just enough to be unmistakable. Charlotte watched this happen. I could tell by the way she kept scanning the room, trying to locate herself in the flow. She smiled when spoken to, but the smile didn't land the same way anymore. It no longer organized the room around her. Ben stayed close to Laura as the evening settled, his hand finding hers more often, his body angled toward her even when others spoke. He didn't ask questions, he didn't need to. The social information had already arrived. By the time the last speeches ended, the story of the day had quietly corrected itself. Not on paper. In memory, Charlotte had changed the guest list. She had altered the layout. She had taken territory without permission. And in doing so, she had revealed exactly how she believed love, authority, and celebration were supposed to work. Everyone saw it. No one argued. That's the kind of exposure that lasts. As I packed up my binder and checked off the final logistics, I thought about how often people confuse access with entitlement. How easily help becomes control when no one interrupts early enough. Weddings don't end when the lights go down. They echo forward, carried by stories guests tell later. By details they remember. By the quiet conclusions they draw about who made the day easier and who made it about themselves. If you've ever watched something similar unfold or lived through a moment where help crossed a line, you already know how this kind of resolution works. You don't announce it. You feel it. And it stays with you.